This week on the BackTable podcast.
What we really need to be doing, of course, is training the people on the ground so that our impact is really an exponential impact and not a linear one. We can go there and we can do cases, but in the end, you benefit only a very small number of people that way. Whereas if you go there and you train them and you have them doing cases, even if it's things like biopsies and drainages and nephrostomies and cholecystostomies, those things are, once we train them, they can hit the ground running pretty quickly, as long as we can also figure out, of course, the supply chain and getting them the materials.
Welcome to the BackTable podcast, your source for all things IR. You can find all previous episodes of our podcast on iTunes, our app, or Spotify. This is Michael Barraza returning as your host. Today's episode is sponsored by RadPad. RadPad was developed by physicians for physicians, providing clinically proven radiation protection during cine and digital subtraction angiography. Don't bet your career or your health on anything less. Trust RadPad radiation protection shields for all your fluoro-guided interventions. See radpad.com for more information. Contact info at RadPad for a free radiation evaluation and a no-brainer radiation protection cap, and let them know you heard it on the BackTable podcast. Today, I'm excited to welcome my friend, Dr. Stephen Hunt from the University of Pennsylvania, to discuss his volunteer work with RadAid and specifically IR for Nigeria. Thank you, Stephen, for sharing your Sunday with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me back, Michael.
How did you first get involved with the volunteer opportunity you're doing in Nigeria?
Sure.
And when?
I've been doing some international IR development for a few years now, and have been to a few countries and really seen the birth of interventional radiology in a number of places. One of the first that really sparked my enthusiasm towards this was in Nepal, when I went to their first Nepalese interventional radiology meeting, which was back in 2016, so about 3 years ago.
Yeah, I remember that was when I was a fellow.
Right. And so I had spent a few weeks over there, and me and some other radiologists were traveling around and kind of doing an assessment of their radiology facilities, and working with their health minister to sort of come up with a written assessment of how to move forward with development of radiology in their country, because their country, similar to Nigeria, is at that stage of development where it just makes sense that they're moving out of the level of economic development, that it makes sense to bring in these more advanced medical technologies, and where a lot more of the population is demanding access to more advanced healthcare. And so it made sense, and it really was exciting to me to watch as they brought back some folks from abroad who had trained in Singapore and elsewhere. And they brought in folks from India, and just really got together a core group of people, along with a lot of enthusiastic folks who did not know IR but had trained in some basic IR procedures within Nepal. And to see that whole form, and now that has burgeoned into a real focal group of dedicated interventional radiologists within Nepal, both in Kathmandu and in some of the other cities in Nepal. But to kind of set the stage for Nigeria, I mean, here in the United States, we have, close to, no one's sure of the exact number, but close to about 6,000 interventional radiologists, somewhere in the 5,000 to 6,000 range. And that's for a population of 300 million. So you're looking at about one IR per 50,000 or so. And in Nigeria, you've got basically, even if you count everybody who's doing it part-time, less than 5 practicing interventional radiologists. At the most, you might say there's 1 per 40 million people, So we've got a lot of work to do. Even if you were just going to get up to the United States numbers, which everyone thinks there's just simply not enough interventional radiologists in the United States, you'd have to have 4,000 interventional radiologists in Nigeria right now. But in addition to the specifically around IR, there's just a huge need for any kind of surgery interventions and any of these kind of medical care there. And as the population emerges into a low to middle income economy, the people are really looking towards healthcare as being one of their big expenditures of budget. So about $15 billion is estimated to leave Nigeria every year, headed abroad to seek medical care. So an example I'll give is, a person wants to get a chest port. Right now, there are very few people in Nigeria who are placing chest ports, and definitely no interventional radiologist, with the exception of now Dr. Nina Lowell, who I'll come back to. He's now operating out of Lagos. But in any case, what those folks have to do is, go abroad and get one. And so commonly, if they'll come to the United States, people with means, they'll fly over, they'll pay my hospital $15,000 to put a $189 device into their body by virtue of the fact that they don't have the trained personnel to do that back home in Nigeria. And obviously, it's an enormous expense and time and getting a visa and buying the flights and hotels. So you can imagine that's a very inefficient process, and what just having someone there in the country who can do those kinds of very routine and basic IR procedures, what a difference that would make. But in addition to those kind of things, you can think of abscess drainages and all of the things that we do. Very often, there's a huge shortage of surgery around the world. I mean, we're talking about less than half the world with really access to surgery. So you're talking about 3.5 billion, 4 billion people who really don't have access to surgical services. And this is the same thing I saw in Nepal. So if someone has trauma, there's no surgeon really there to do an exploratory laparotomy or to stop the bleeding, or if they have trauma on their farm, whether it be road accidents or these things. And so consequently, accidents are very high up on the list of causes of death in these countries, as well as things like, abscesses that don't heal and stuff. And so there's a lot that IR can do in those situations that could, perhaps obviate the need for more intensive or more, invasive procedures.
So, Stephen, you talked about, other needs for other surgical services and things like that. I mean, are there other groups of physicians there when you're making these trips?
So there are physicians from different organizations. I have met people in some of the hospitals, not at UCH, but in other hospitals from, for example, Médecins Sans Frontières and some organizations like that. Now most of them are focused on public health outreach, sure. And vaccination programs. Some of them are doing some surgical things, but there is really no global organization for meeting the needs of interventional radiology worldwide, and that's something I think that we have an opportunity within the interventional radiology community to create. Now, the organization that we've been working with is RadAid, which has started to build out an interventional radiology kind of wing of it with under the leadership of Dr. Andrew Kesselman, who's up at Cornell. So there is a development now within the RadAid organization, which is the largest international aid organization for radiology. But like I said, there's no dedicated IR specific relief organization towards that need. And whether we do it together with RadAid or whether we do it through our individual efforts, I think that there really is this opportunity around the world to make a tremendous impact. And so what we really need to be doing, of course, is training the people on the ground so that our impact is really an exponential impact and not a linear one. We can go there and we can do cases, but in the end, you benefit only a very small number of people that way. Whereas if you go there and you train them and you have them doing cases, even if it's things like biopsies and drainages, and nephrostomies and cholecystostomies, those things are, once we train them, they can hit the ground running pretty quickly, as long as we can also figure out, of course, the supply chain and getting them the materials. For example, when we went there, some of the cases we did were biopsies and drainages for the most part. So one of the first cases was a young lady, a 20-year-old, who had a very, very large probably post-tubercular abscess. I mean, we're talking about a very large mass coming out of her side And when you looked at the imaging, you could tell that she had what had started as a pulmonary tuberculous abscess, and then it had gotten into her spine, kind of the Pott's disease picture, and a large retroperitoneal component, and then extending all the way out into her side. So we drained, the superficial component. She had gone around like this for more than 18 months, getting bigger and bigger and wasting away and getting very, very ill. So just after draining liters and liters of, pus out of the superficial component, she was significantly better by the next day, and then brought her back for draining the deeper component under CT guidance. And the plan is once she's completely, dry, that the surgeons are willing to go back and do kind of a stabilization surgery if necessary for her spine, given its kind of invasive component with that. But the point is just by want of no one being able to do this, the surgeons didn't want to open up a can of worms by just draining the superficial component. And so she kind of got ignored by the medical system, and wasn't able to get something done. Another case was actually the head of cardiology came to us and said, listen, my mother has this very large cyst in her liver, and it's probably a hydatid cyst from echinococcus, but nobody wants to touch it. And so, he called her up, and she drove 4 hours down with his dad, and we drained it, and you could see the scoleates in the
No way.
we drained it. You would dump alcohol in the bucket, and the little tapeworms would rise to the top. So it was pretty, obviously not something we see a lot of in the United States, but able to make a tremendous impact. I mean, she immediately expressed relief from the pressure symptoms, and she had been losing weight and stuff because this thing had gotten so large. But there's, so a lot of the basic, drainage kind of procedures. But think about something like lung biopsy. They have CT scanners. Yeah. They had the biopsy equipment for biopsies, but they didn't know kind of like that skill of doing it and how you would go about practically doing that. And so we had a day where we brought down a number of patients to get a lung biopsy, and the thoracic surgeon was there, and I see he had tears in his eyes as he was standing there, watching the procedure. And I said, well, how are you doing this now? And he told me, well, I look at the CT, and then I go up to their room, and I kind of just blindly stab based on my memory where I was. And then, about 40% of the time I can get tissue, because a lot of people come in with advanced disease.
That's pretty impressive.
And so I said, well, what about, chest tube? What about he said, well, if they seem really short of breath, I put a chest tube in. But I mean, it's sad that's the, by want of just people, they have the CT scanner, they have the so it's really a matter of teaching them, and then of course teaching them how to place the chest tube when necessary. So we can really make a tremendous difference with just teaching very basic IR procedures. And so one of the really cool things that I hadn't planned, but a couple residents got involved from a resident from out in LA, one of the LA programs, and then another resident from up in New York from Mount Sinai. And so they came over and were teaching. They built some phantoms right on site. So they brought over some gel and built some phantoms right on site, and we're teaching basic ultrasound guided biopsy and drainage using ultrasound. So that was very useful. Also, with our collaboration with RadAid, they have a Mentis, one of those simulators. I
saw on your Instagram.
Right. So that was fun, because obviously we weren't doing any vascular cases because their fluoroscopy unit was down, but we could show them kind of some of the basics there, and that's more to get them it's more to get them excited about the potential. I think it's going to be some time before we can really get vascular-based cases going. And obviously, they have to have functioning equipment. So that's a piece of it. But it allowed them to, a lot of them were very excited. And I mean, radiologists came from all over Nigeria, from every corner of the country, to come to this symposium and to participate in the lectures and the hands-on. And there was really just a lot of enthusiasm. And that had been the point, was really to kickstart, the passion within the country, and get people really know that there's brothers and sisters abroad who want to help them. And at the end of it all, one of my fellows, Hamed Nilwa, he has moved back to Nigeria, and he's operating out of Lagos, and so he has brought some of those folks down from UCH to do observerships and help him down in Lagos, and kind of get some more hands-on training within the country. And that's what we need, is really to build around the nucleus of folks there who have that passion and who have that interest, and who are willing to train the first generation of interventional radiologists there.
Stephen, one of the other things that I saw from your Instagram page, and I'd like to encourage our listeners to follow it. It's IR for Nigeria. It's IR number 4 Nigeria. Is one of the photos showed you reviewing cases for the day with the UCH residents, in hospital rounds. What is a normal day for you like there?
So when we first arrived, because we had worked so intensively before we got there, we showed up with several page. They had a several page document, 5 or 6 pages of cases that they wanted to present and see what we could do. Now, a number of them were for transarterial embolization, which we would have loved to do, but they didn't have the the equipment. And some of those folks, I think, have since gone down and been treated by Dr. Neil Lau down in Lagos, where he has the kind of equipment and stuff. But in any case, those just to have them be ready and to show these cases and to have that enthusiasm. So obviously, it begins with reviewing cases, possible cases to do for the day. And then showing them that this is a clinical discipline. So we have to go and round on the folks that we've done procedures on. We have to go and do the tube rounds and see how the drainage is going and whether the flushing is working and how well those patients are doing clinically and what are their vital signs and whether they do any labs. And so starting from what is primarily a diagnostic practice and moving it into interventional practice, there's a whole nother side of medicine there for that. And then I think this idea of, if you're really going to build this, it's going to require buy-in from the rest of your colleagues in medicine there. And so this idea of multidisciplinary rounds. And so we talked about cases with the nephrology attending, and we actually did some pediatric biopsies with him for renal biopsy, just medical renal biopsies. And so I think that's obviously going to be a component is trying to engage the folks outside of radiology and show them the potential of what interventional radiology can bring to their practice. So that's a big potential. And so that was the typical day there. During the course of the conference, of course, was a lot of lectures, but we would do these morning rounds, go over the cases, kind of get things set up, and then go off and do a bunch of lectures in the morning while the part of the team was setting up for the cases. And then in the afternoon, we did cases kind of into the evening. And so that's how the typical day was run there.
So you brought up, yet again, another important point, and that's equipment. What do these different hospitals need in terms of equipment in order to get started? I mean, we're assuming these people already have a reasonably functioning diagnostic department.
Right. So most hospitals have ultrasound and CT facilities. Some of them have MR, although it's usually 0.3 or 0.5 Tesla, and so it's not really high-end MR. In some places they have a high-end MR, but the problem is that they haven't fully completed the installation, or there's just so many logistic hurdles to getting it functioning. Think about helium delivery. Think about, all the pieces that go into running a functional MR department. So that's an issue. In terms of fluoroscopy, the better hospitals have, functioning units, whether it be for interventional cardiology, or just basic fluoroscopy for spine procedures and things like that. But many of the public institutions lack that. And so part of it is working with them. I think it's going to be more business development side of working with them for the public-private partnership that many of them are already doing, but helping them to, in particular, what you see in a lot of the developing world is the notion of at the hospital level of a maintenance contract. It hasn't really been built into their structure. A lot of times a governor, for example, or some politician will get a certain pot of money for getting some new piece of equipment in. But then they don't, write that maintenance contract. So it means that a year in, when something breaks or, they're not getting the required maintenance, that suddenly you have an albatross of a non-functioning piece of equipment, So that's a frustration, everywhere I've gone in the world, Vietnam or Nepal or Nigeria or wherever. And so I think that that's something that, it's going to be a gradual, it's a culture change, and it's reinforcing to them, how critical that is to making a functioning department. And you have to, of course, budget for that. And it's not an easy problem to solve. The other issue, of course, is consumables. So most of the consumables we would be used to using over here from Cook or Merit or any of the big purveyors, they're quite expensive and from an economic model over there. However, there are markets in more developed places like in China and India where they're making those supplies and equipment much cheaper. And so I think that that's where the real opportunity lies. Of course, eventually what you'd like is local manufacturing in Nigeria or in the country of use. But realistically, I think we're going to have a stage where most of that stuff is being purchased out of China and India, and then shipped there and distributed within the continent. So I think that's the stage that we're entering right now. And so it's really, once we get the training, it's kind of the chicken and the egg. We've got to get the folks trained to use the stuff. Right now, they're living off of a lot of donations. And I would say that, both monetary and supplies donations, we are willing to accept either, of course, for the IR for Nigeria project. And they can reach out to me, which I know you'll have my contact in the podcast. They can reach out to on the IR for Nigeria webpage or through RadAid. All of those are good venues. And another project I want to highlight, kind of a sister project over in Tanzania called Road to IR. So it's number 2, Road, the word to IR. And those folks in Tanzania, they're a little bit ahead of us in the sense that they have a lot of functioning equipment at the hospitals they're working out of Mulambini. And so they're doing more advanced IR procedures, and they have a lot of teams going over, pretty much a team almost every month, or constantly have a team there. And again, they're working with both vendors and with other donations, and a lot of that effort is built out of Yale. So the road to IR is another great project that people who are interested in doing interventional radiology abroad can look at.
So, Stephen, one more question I had for you is, in addition to contributing, monetarily, how could any interested interventional radiologist get involved with this to help?
Yeah. So, first of all, I'd say that, it's not just about the doctors. Obviously, we have to train the whole team. And so nurses and technologists, I think that those are every bit as critical as the docs, because you have to kind of, when you go over there, teach them that it's this whole culture of, the IR doc can't do everything. The technologists know a lot of the equipment and supplies and can help manage all of that. And the doctors, of course, are training in the hands-on. But what doctors can do is, of course, either volunteer with our effort or with RadAid or with Road to IR, any of those efforts. And then I think that we as a community have to come together really and think about how to establish, perhaps a dedicated interventional radiology effort, whether it be within the existing organizations or whether it be kind of on our own. And then I think that engage with SIR, the global efforts through SIR, the Society of Interventional Radiology here, and with the British Society of Interventional Radiology to kind of all come together as a community and recognize that this is a worldwide need. There's a worldwide shortage of access to these services. And there's the potential for direct impact, both through volunteer work, through recycling of perhaps, expired goods, particularly for the training portions of the program, whether it be through engaging the vendors. If you have contacts in industry, I do a bit of consulting with industry. And so that's always something where I'm willing to, contact them and try to get them to contribute to our efforts. But if people have business sense and can think about developing these markets, I mean, it's kind of, there's so many different ways in which you can help to build out in these places and to engage. It started for me just being on my own and engaging, but I think that trying to join existing teams, you're going to leverage your impact, obviously. So I encourage, but I think that everyone is going to be involved in whatever level that they're able to commit, and so I would say that all of the above, supplies, equipment donations, working with getting donations from industry, along with volunteering of your time and effort, and getting your techs and nurses involved.
Well, Stephen, this is a remarkable effort, and just a reminder to our listeners, please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us if you need to get in touch with Stephen or anyone else involved to look for ways to contribute. And Stephen, thank you for joining us to come and talk about this. And lastly, look for IR4 Nigeria on Instagram. That's IR4 Nigeria. Thanks, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you so much.